Hello and welcome to another episode of The Security Affair, the flagship podcast of the Centre for International Security and Economic Strategy, or CISES, where we explore strategy, defence, economics and international security. I'm Alexander Anderson, Director of Policy at CISES. In a previous episode, we discussed information as a modern battlefield, how narratives, legitimacy and influence shape international politics. Today, we want to build upon that discussion by focusing less on definitions and more on how states actually govern information practice and what that tells us about power, security and democratic risk. I'm joined once again by Bandish Oza, who recently completed his MA in International Relations at King's College London and is a policy analyst at CISES, focusing on South Asia and global information politics. Bandish's thesis examined how narratives around democracy and security are used as tools in information warfare to legitimise or delegitimise states and shape policy outcomes. Bandish, it's great to have you back.
Thank you for having me, Alex. Pleasure to be here.
When governments talk about information today, they're no longer just talking about messaging or persuasion. We see regulation, content moderation, rules, and even direct restrictions on access. When do you think information stopped being treated primarily as speech and started being treated as something closer to infrastructure that states feel they need to manage?
I think information has always been treated as infrastructure. So if you look at World War I and World War II, information was very much regulated and moderated even then. So the 20 committee, so-called 20 committee of Britain, basically double cross committee, or all sorts of Russian information warfare programs, disinformation programs. So information has always been sort of treated as a commodity or as infrastructure. I think what has changed in the recent past is who gets to control those flows of information. So when it was World War I or World War II, information was predominantly in the hands of the few, be it the state governments or some media houses. It was not as democratic as it is now. So in the last few years, at least in the last century or so, I think what has changed is not how governments treat information, but about what has changed is how much information is available publicly and who has access to make and distribute information. And I think that is why we have a completely new approach by state governments, by nations, in how they treat information, how they regulate information. So I think that's the basic distinction. It's not really about governments treating it differently. It's just about people getting wider audience getting access to it.
So maybe moving from the history into something much more recent, a very visible example of clamping down on information during moments of political tension was when Iran imposed widespread internet restrictions during its protests, severely limiting access to the outside world through both landline and internet. So what does the increasing normalization of such shutdowns tell us about how states now think about control, risk and legitimacy in the information space, perhaps in the digital information space?
Definitely. So wherever there is widespread protests everywhere or national crises, the first knee-jerk reaction of any government or any state institution is to shut down the internet services, because that just completely stops the flow of information. How fair is it? Well, that's a question for experts on democracy to determine. However, in order to clamp down in any anti-government movements like in Iran, it is imperative to cut the information flow, because all sorts of activism these days happens through social media. So whether it's a call to gather around at the city center of Tehran, or it's the call to call for the Ayatollah to resign, it's all of that happens predominantly on social media. Social media and online connectivity is what connects all these different protesters to each other. So that's obviously going to be the first reaction of any government to shut down the flow of information. Of course, it's not really in the spirit of democracy to completely choke the only source of information that people have available. But that's sort of the direction which is taking. So even in the case of India, the Kashmir Valley, wherever there's any widespread protests or terrorist attacks, the first instinct of the government is to turn the switch off on internet and cellular connectivity. And that is how modern governance is going to be. That is how modern anti-protest governance is going to be for the foreseeable future.
So one of the takeaways from our last discussion on information was that you highlighted the fact that information warfare is more important during peacetime, ironically, than during times of conflict, perhaps during interstate conflict rather than domestic. So, but in how much would you say this modern information control is really about persuasion? How much is it about prevention and managing risk, especially as you mentioned in this anti-protest governance method?
So whenever there is information warfare that is perpetuated during peacetime, it is always about persuasion. You're persuading through non-military means another state actor or a non-state actor to behave how you want them to behave. So persuasion obviously is one of the biggest factors why nations pursue information warfare during peacetime. Risk management, it's very interesting you say that, because whenever any nation can foresee that some sort of a risk, internal or external, is posed at the state government or a nation, uh, as we see in Iran and Tehran, the first reaction is to stop the flow of information. So in such cases when there is risk management involved, the knee-jerk reaction often is to stop information rather than put more information out there. So I don't know if information warfare is relevant when it comes to the risk management, because risk management is usually more overt. There are different cases. For instance, if the US was about to attack Venezuela, which did happen, so US can prepare different sorts of propaganda, not propaganda, but like information packages of their own side of story about how they want to measure or how they want to respond to whatever fallout may occur by them violating the international system. But apart from that, if there is a direct external or internal threat to one's own nation, I don't think that information warfare in subtler ways can really help out. At that point, the best way for the best go-to response of nations is to just clamp down on information altogether.
Would you say clamping down on information is a part of information warfare of sorts?
That's a good question. So my understanding of information warfare is that if there is to be warfare, information must flow. Only then can there be warfare. If there is no information flow, so let me put it in a different manner. Let's say in traditional warfare, bullets are being exchanged, right? You fire a bullet at me, I fire a bullet at you. But if we stop the bullets altogether, is it really warfare of any sorts? So I would, my personal reading of information warfare is not that you completely stop information and then there is no war to be fought. Then you just monopolize the entire channels. So it's a very, very interesting question that certainly warrants further thinking.
Okay, right. In democracies, the debate over information often plays out on social media and regulation rather than outright restriction and clamping down. The European Union has expanded, at times controversially, regulation of digital spaces, from platforms being more transparent, one of the key aspects you mentioned last time, to obligations around illegal content and disinformation, which is framed as protecting democratic debate and public safety. At the same time, critics worry about potential government overreach and unintended consequences of such policies. How should we understand these regulatory approaches as part of the broader information governance landscape?
I would take you back to a bit of theory for this question. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Hobbesian idea of the state of nature. That at the beginning there was utter lawlessness, might was right, was the rule of the law, rule of the land. And then in order to have some sort of order in society, the citizens of the society must surrender some amount of sovereignty to the head of the state. It can be a monarch, it can be a government, it can be a multilateral institution like the European Union. So they surrendered some amount of sovereignty in order to gain some resemblance of order. Now we are going back to that sort of thing where you cannot really have unlimited liberties and also order. We have seen in the recent times how people often misuse liberties, especially in the information space, to spread all sorts of propaganda, disinformation, and in circumstances like that, it's really difficult to let those liberties keep those liberties intact while also fighting against it. So all these regulations that you talk about, whether it's European Union, Singapore is doing a lot of regulatory work when it comes to data science and information. All these regulations are sort of a way of ensuring that there is some semblance of order. It doesn't all uh, descend into chaos. Obviously, it can be misused to suppress dissidents, like it's happening in Iran, for instance, the most relevant example right now. But that's just how international order will remain for a while, because it's really difficult to regulate to fight against information warfare without not encroaching on some degree of liberties.
So what you just said, the balance between liberty and security, I think that's been prominent, especially in American discourse since 9/11, where they have had to, I mean, not in the information space, but as well, it's this trade-off between liberty and security. This raises a difficult line drawing problem. Where do we draw the line? Where does disinformation start and where does legitimate political grievances end? So democracies routinely regulate hate speech or incitement to violence, but that can expand into areas that are more politically sensitive. So from your perspective, where does legitimate harm prevention end, and when does political censure begin? And how easy is it for policymakers to recognise when they're crossing that line? I'm assuming it's not easy.
No, it's not at all easy. Uh, when you talk about where you draw the line, now it is very difficult to just have a very clear cut line, a clear demarcation of what's censorship and what's legitimate fighting against information warfare. In democracies, at least, what one can hope for is that there are lots of institutions who are working together to preserve democracy and to fight against threats to the democracy. So, in a democracy, all you can hope for is that if there is government overreach encroaching on civil liberties, which ultimately amounts to censorship, then other democratic institutions will step in, will first of all recognize the encroachment, recognize the violation, and step in. So in a democracy, all you can if you look at theories of democracy, no one agrees that democracy is a perfect system. It's a deeply flawed system, but it's the one that's the best of the options out there. So it's, again, as I mentioned, it's difficult to clearly demarcate. Um, I as an I as an expert can certainly not say that okay, this is censorship and this is not, because there are a lot of factors that common citizens are not privy to. You don't know if MI6 is tracking a credible terror threat, or is it just made up. So all you can do in that sense is just trust the processes of democracy, trust all the institutions of democracy, and rely on the checks and balances of democracy to weigh each other out, and just have to keep the faith that okay, maybe it won't amount to censorship. It will stop at fighting against information warfare.
I think that might be increasingly hard to do when trust in institutions is slipping and democracy sometimes slip into hybrid regimes. But moving on to public debate, we tend to focus on dramatic threats. In the UK, child safety with Twitter's AI recently, foreign bot networks, deepfakes, but many of the most consequential interventions are often in the background. How algorithms work, content moderation, compliance systems built to satisfy regulators. What do you think people most often misunderstand about how information manipulation and control actually works today in this quieter sense that we don't really see on the surface?
That's a very good question. We touched upon this topic a little bit in our last episode. So obviously, how content is regulated on social media platforms, it plays a big role. How the algorithmic manipulation is obviously a big factor when it comes to this. So yeah, it's really about it boils down to mainly to major 2 to 3 points. First of all, regulations of a particular nation. So, do the regulations of a nation allow for such practices to proliferate? So that's what the EU is trying to do. It's trying to heavily regulate how these sort of information flows are practiced, how they are propagated. and that's, again, it's a gray line. It's a very fine line of differentiation, as we talked about, between censorship and genuine regulation. So that's the first thing, regulation. Second of all, the media companies also have a big role to play. So be it digital media or be it X or Meta, they also have a big role to play in how transparent they are being in how algorithmic manipulation or algorithmic arrangements happen. And thirdly, it lies, ultimately everything lies with the users of social media, or the consumers of information. You and I, as consumers of information, it's ultimately up to us whether we believe in something, whether we fact check something, or whether we forward it without thinking. So ultimately, it's in the hands of the consumers of information, which forms the largest dynamic of which forms the largest demographic in this entire chain, the pyramid of regulations. So yeah, it's just it boils down to these three practices, these three major demographics, which is government regulators, private companies, and the people who use it.
Thank you. So, discussions on information warfare often centre on a small number of major powers. We mentioned the role of the private sector as well last episode. Would you say that the focus on major powers and perhaps transnational corporations such as Meta is justified, or does it just risk overlooking how widely these tools are now used across different political systems, different actors, including by states that see themselves as defending democratic order rather than undermining it domestically?
That's a good question as well. So obviously, the focus is often on larger states like the United States or China or Russia or even Iran, for that matter, when this information warfare is discussed. And obviously, the companies, the largest information, like social media companies like Meta and X, are under scrutiny. Now, if you look at the platform side of it, the private entities, there are only a handful of platforms or companies through which majority of information flows. So social media giants like Meta and X form the social media, like they monopolize the social media domain. Companies like Google, they monopolize, they capture a large market of how people receive information or how people access a large amount of information. And now you can add things like ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, etc. to it as well. Grok as well. There's a whole lot of controversy around Grok right now. So you can all the AI companies as well. That how are they training the AI models to behave? So these are the way. So when it comes to companies, I think the focus should very much be on these larger companies because they regulate more than half of information flowing around the world. When it comes to state actors, US and the big countries, they just get a bad reputation because they practice it most often and they are obviously more visible when they practice it. But if you look at non-state actors like ISIS, for instance, they are also very much leveraging this information boom that has happened in the last couple of years, last 2 decades or so. So there are public videos of them publicly beheading people. That's meant to spread propaganda. That's meant to that is they bank on the virality of the content and virality of social media to propagate their own messages. So it's not entirely fair to just focus on the big nations like US, China, Russia, Iran, etc. But I think when it comes to companies, the burden very much lies with the big tech.
Thank you. So, if you were advising a policymaker tasked with responding to information threats, what would you say is the most common mistake they make? Something that seems sensible in the short term, but could create long-term political or institutional risks.
We touched upon this a little bit. So when we are talking about censorship versus regulation, you made the good point that public trust in institutions is eroding now, and that is precisely because the first reaction of any government institution is to clamp down on information. I think the way to go about countering information warfare is by being more transparent. So if government institutions, be it in the regulations or in their censorship, whatever you call it, if they are more transparent about why they are doing it, if people know the reasons behind it, the thought process that goes behind it, I think it would do wonders for public trust in those institutions. And that is how you defeat information warfare in the long run. You cannot really control narratives without transcending into censorship, which is very, very anti-democratic. If you want to remain within the realm of democracy while also, trying to counter information warfare, I think edification and transparency are the key. So you teach your people what to believe, what not to believe, rather than choosing for them what they want to believe or what they don't want to believe. So I think that's a very fine line that policymakers have to navigate these days. And I think EU is trying very hard to toe that line. Whether they're successful or not, it will take a couple of years to figure it out, but that's the way to go about it.
So if you had to summarize the modern information battlefield in one sentence, which is not easy, how would you put it?
Every piece of information is motivated and has deep consequences, not just on your own life or your own friend group or your own meme circle, but it has larger implications on domestic as well as international policy, security, and economy. Whoever is able to manipulate these processes the best wins the battle of information.
As we start to wrap up, what would you say are the three main takeaways you'd want listeners to remember about information as a tool in contemporary politics?
I'll just go on from what the one or rather two sentences I said earlier. So the first takeaway is information is not passive. Every bit of information you consume, be it just a silly meme of Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, it has some agenda behind it. It has some potential to snowball into something larger, which brings me to the second takeaway, that every piece of information that is circulated has real life implications on be it on your life, be it local governments, be it international governments, some way or the other, it's all connected. And thirdly, any state or non-state actor which effectively captures these processes, which effectively learns how to manipulate them better than the enemy, certainly has an edge over all their adversaries or all their allies when it comes to the information space.
Bandish, thank you very much for your time.
So it was my pleasure, Alex. Thanks for having me.
The Security Affair is the Centre for International Security and Economic Strategies podcast looking at the ideas, events and decisions shaping strategy, defence, economics and international security. I'm Alexander Anderson. Our guest has been Bandish Oza.